On the 3rd of May, 1884, on the south steps of the courthouse at Miles City, in Custer County, Montana Territory, a woman of 25 stood above 200 men and offered them the only thing she had left, which was herself, and did it with her chin up and her eyes dry, daring any man in that crowd to look her in the face. Her name was Ailsa Kennard, and she had been born in Aberdeenshire and brought to the Powder River country at 17, and her father had been dead since the 9th of February, and he had died owing $1,140. The sheriff had the sale posted for 11 o'clock. 1/4 section on the divide, a 2-room house of cottonwood logs, a pole corral, a spring, and 40 head of indifferent cattle. It would go to the highest bidder, and the money would go to the note, and whatever was over would go to her, and there would not be anything over. So at 10 minutes to 11, before the sheriff could read the notice, Ailsa Kennard went up 2 steps and turned around. "I will say this once, and I will say it plain," she said, "and then you may do as you like. There is a note on my father's place for $1,140. I have no money and no people and no prospects, but I have a house and a spring and the whole of my strength, and I am prepared to marry any man in this county who will assume that note. He will get a wife who can work, and a 1/4 section, and a woman who will not complain about the winters, and I will get to keep the only ground my mother is buried in. That is the whole of the bargain, and there is nothing hidden in it." It went badly, and it went badly fast. Somebody laughed. Somebody at the back called out a figure, $400, in the voice a man uses at a horse sale, and the crowd took it up, because 200 men standing in a spring wind with nothing to do will take up anything. And inside of a 1/4 of a minute the courthouse steps at Miles City had turned into a thing that no one had intended and everyone was doing. Ailsa Kennard did not move. She waited for it to run down, which took longer than it should have, and when there was enough quiet to be heard in, she said, without raising her voice, "I am not for sale." And out of the back of that crowd, a man came forward. He was 38, and he was dressed like every 3rd man there, which is to say in a canvas coat gone the color of dust and boots that had been resoled twice, and he had a war bag over his shoulder, and nobody in that crowd could have told you his name except the few who had ridden with him, and those few would have told you he did not talk much, and could hold a herd on a bad night better than anybody in the county. He went past her up the steps to the clerk's table, and he set the war bag down, and he counted out $1,140 in double eagles and paper, and it took him a while, and the whole of the south side of that courthouse watched him do it in a silence you could have hung a coat on. The clerk wrote the receipt. The sheriff read it and signed it, and said the note was satisfied, and the sale was off. The man took the receipt and the title papers and came back down 2 steps and held them out to Ailsa Kennard. "Mister," she said, "I have just told 200 men what I am willing to trade, and you have just paid it. I will not pretend I do not know what this is." "You do not know what this is," he said. "You said you were not for sale." "I did. I know," said Cyrus Locke. "I am buying your freedom, not you." He put the papers into her hand and closed her fingers on them because she had not closed them herself. "That is the deed, and that is the receipt, and the encumbrance is off it, and there is no obligation in it of any kind whatsoever, and I am not asking you for one thing. Not now, and not ever, and if any man in this county tells you different, you may send him to me. Do not marry anybody unless you want to. You have got a place. Go home to it." And then he picked up the empty war bag and walked down the steps and through the crowd, and the crowd let him through, and he was gone up the street before she had got her breath back. She stood there holding the deed to her own land in front of 200 men, and she had never in her life been so angry, and it took her the better part of a month to work out that what she was angry at was that she had made herself into a thing on a courthouse step and a stranger had refused to buy it. She went home to the Divide. The place was 24 miles south, and it was 2 rooms and a pole corral and 40 head, and it was hers, free and clear. And she was 25 years old and had $11 and a spring wagon and no idea on earth how to make it pay. Because her father had not made it pay in 8 years, and her father had been the cleverest man she ever knew. She spent the first 3 weeks doing what he had done, which was cattle, and by the middle of the 4th week she understood in her bones what he had never let himself understand, which was that the Kennard place was no good for cattle, and never had been. The grass was thin. The ground was gravel over shale. 40 head was all it would carry, and 40 head would not feed one person. And her father had known it by 1880 at the latest, and had gone on anyway, borrowing against it, because a man who has brought his family 4,000 miles cannot afford to be wrong. And on the 11th of June, standing at the spring at 6 in the morning with a bucket in her hand, watching it come up out of the shale, at a rate she had never once thought about because it had simply always been there, Ailsa Kinnaird had the thought that changed her life. There was no other live water for 14 miles in any direction. She had grown up with that fact the way a person grows up with the sky. Her father had said it 100 times, always as a complaint about how far the neighbors were. He had never once said it as an asset, because he had come out of Aberdeenshire, where water fell out of the air for free, and he could not have made himself believe, in 8 years, that water was worth more than grass. The Texas Trail came up through that country from the south. In 1884 it came up hard, herd after herd, 2,000 and 3,000 head at a time, walking north to the Montana ranges through 14 dry miles of the Powder River Divide. Ailsa Kinnaird put a hand-lettered board on a post at the trail crossing on the 16th of June. It said, "Water A&D one night grass, $15 the 100 head. Ask at house." The first trail boss who came in laughed at her. He was a Texan named Dill, with 2,600 head 3 weeks out of Ogallala, and he sat his horse in her yard and told her he had watered cattle free on open range from the Nueces to the Yellowstone for 19 years, and did not intend to start paying a woman for the privilege at his time of life. "Then you will not be paying me," said Ailsa Kinnaird. "You will be taking them on north from here. It is 14 miles to the next live water, and you will make it in a day and a half with the calves you are carrying, and I have counted your remuda from the ridge, and you are short 2 horses of doing it comfortable." "You have counted my remuda." "I have counted your remuda, Mr. Dill, and I have counted your cattle, and I make it 2,640, and if you would like to argue the 40, I will walk down and count them again in front of you." Dill looked at her for a while. He paid $396, and he told every outfit he met for the rest of that season that there was water on the Divide at $15 the 100, and it was worth it, and the woman could count. By the end of July, she had taken in more money than her father had cleared in 8 years, and she had done it standing at a spring with a tally book in her father's coat, and she had done it herself. She found Cyrus Locke at the end of June, at a line camp on the Tongue, and she had to ask 4 people to find him, because nobody could tell her much about him at all. "You are hard to run down. I am not hiding, ma'am. There is only about 11 of us in a country the size of Scotland. I have come to pay you $1,140. "No," said Cyrus Locke. "I did not ask." "No," he said again, and went on with the latigo he was working on, and did not look up, and Ailsa Kinnaird discovered that there is a particular kind of quiet man against whom argument is not so much lost as absorbed. She sat down on the top rail of the corral. "Then I will sit here until you tell me why." He worked the latigo for a while. "Your father gave me a floor to sleep on in the winter of '77, he said at last. "I had been frozen out of a job on the mussel shell in November, and I walked in here in December with nothing but what I stood in, and he put me on for the season, and never took a cent out of my wages for the bed nor the board. I asked him what I owed him, and he said a man does not charge for a floor. He set the latigo down. That is all of it. It is not a fine story, and there is not any more to it. You paid $1,140 for a floor. I paid what I had," said Cyrus Locke. The summer of 1884 on the Powder River Divide had a shape to it, and the narrator will not pretend it was eventful, because the quiet of it was the whole of its worth. He came by. He did not say why, and she did not ask. He mended the corral that had been falling down since 1881, and he did it without being asked, and without mentioning it afterward, and he showed her how to read a trail boss for whether the man would pay before the water or after it, which is the difference between being a business and being a charity. She fed him. She was a bad cook, and got better. She learned that he had been born in Tennessee in 1846, and had been cowboying since he was 16, and had been putting money by since 1872, 12 years of it, $40 a month, and no vices worth the name. On the 9th of July a herd came through in the evening, and the trail boss wanted the water at first light, and Cyrus and Ailsa sat out on the step counting the money after, in the long northern dusk that in that country in July goes on until 10 at night. $412, she said, in one evening. My father wore himself into the ground for 8 years on this quarter section, and it was worth $412 an evening the whole time, and he never once looked at it. He looked at it. He looked at it every morning of his life. Then why? Because he came from a country where water fell out of the sky for nothing, said Cyrus Locke, and a man cannot make himself believe a thing is precious when he grew up wading in it. That is not stupidity, Ailsa, that is only being from somewhere. She sat with that a while. Down at the seep the cattle were making the low grinding sound of 2,000 animals drinking in the dark. You have not once told me I did well. No, every man who has come up that trail this summer has told me I did well, in the voice a man uses on a clever child, and you have sat there for 6 weeks and not said it, and I have decided I am owed an explanation. You are not a clever child, said Cyrus Locke. You are a person running a business, and I do not go around telling grown people they did well at their own work. I will tell you what I have got instead, and then I am going to want to talk about something else. He turned the tally book over in his hands. I have been 11 years in this country, and I have watched about 40 outfits go under on that divide, and I have never once seen anybody look at that spring and see what you saw. Not one man, not your father, and not Craddock's people, and not me, and I slept 40 feet from it for a whole winter. He handed the book back. That is not doing well. That is being the only person who was looking. Ailsa Kinnaird did not trust herself to answer that, and so she did not, and they sat on the step in the dusk with $412 between them, and did not say anything for a long while, and neither of them went inside. She learned about the iron in the 3rd week of July, and she did not learn it from him. She was in his war bag looking for a whetstone with his permission, and there was a stamp iron in the bottom of it, hand-forged, the head of it worn smooth on the edges from 12 years of being carried and never once being hot. It was a heart with a quarter circle under it. "That is a brand," she said. "It is. It is registered? Territory of Montana, 1879, number 411. He took it from her and looked at it and put it back. "My mother's people used it in Tennessee since about 1830. I registered it out here when I had $600 put by and thought I was closer than I was." Ailsa Kennard sat down on the step with the iron in her lap. "You had 12 years of wages in that war bag and a brand registered for a herd, and you spent it on a courthouse step in Miles City on a woman you had not spoken to since you were 31 years old. I did. You will never say that was a fine thing to do. You will sit there and let me say it, and you will not agree with me." "It was not a fine thing," said Cyrus Locke. "It was the thing that was owed. There is a difference, and I would take it as a kindness if you would let it stand." They were close enough on that step that either of them could have crossed the 2 feet between them, and she was aware of it in the whole of her body, and so was he, and the iron was in her lap between them like a thing with an opinion. "Cyrus, Ailsa, I would ask you not to. You do not know what I was going to say." "I know exactly what you were going to say," said Cyrus Locke, "and I would ask you not to say it tonight, because I paid $1,140 on a courthouse step in front of 200 men, and there is not a soul in this county who would ever afterward believe that you came to it free. Not one. They would say I bought it. They would say it in the store at Miles City for 20 years, and some of them would say it kindly, which is worse." He stood up off the step. "So it will keep. If it is real, it will keep, and if it will not keep, then it was not real, and we are both better knowing." That is the most infuriating thing anybody has ever said to me. "Yes, ma'am," said Cyrus Locke, and went to see to his horse. She sat on that step for a long time, after his horse had stopped being audible, with a stamp iron in her lap for a herd that did not exist, and she was 25 years old, and she understood that she had just been refused by the only man who had ever refused her anything for her own sake. If you have come this far with Ailsa Kennard, stay a little longer, because what happens next is the part that decided everything. And if you find yourself moved by stories of love that survived the worst the West could throw at it, the bell beneath this story is how we keep meeting like this. Hollis Craddock came out to the Kennard place on the 2nd of August, with 2 riders behind him. He was 50 years old, and he was range manager for the Tongue River Cattle Company, which was Edinburgh money and 40,000 head, and he had been at the courthouse on the 3rd of May standing at the front, where Ailsa had not noticed him, because she had been busy. "I bought that note off Purvis in November," he said from the saddle, $1,140 at 9%, on a quarter section that will not carry 40 head. You will have wondered why a man would do that. I have stopped wondering, Mr. Craddock. I am standing on the reason. Then we understand each other, and I will not insult you." He looked at the spring. "My South Range runs dry the 2nd week of August every year of the world, and I have got 11,000 head on it. I have been 4 years getting to this ground, and I wrote to my directors in March that I had it. They come out in September. That was a foolish letter to write." "It was," Craddock agreed. "I will give you $9,000 for the quarter section, which is 9 times what it is worth and about 4 times what I would rather pay. No, Miss Kennard, I would ask you to consider that I have said please." "You have not," said Ailsa Kennard, "and I would not sell if you had. My mother is buried 40 feet from where you are sitting." Hollis Craddock took that without any expression at all, which was worse than temper, and turned his horse, and said the sentence she thought about every night for the next 5 weeks. Then you will find out what the country is like when it is not on your side. The blacklist came down through the association inside of 9 days. Cyrus Locke had been 11 years in that country, with a name so clean it was boring, and by the 12th of August there was not an outfit between the Yellowstone and the Wyoming line that would put him on. Nobody told him why. Nobody had to. 2 foremen who had known him a decade could not look at him while they said it. He never once complained about it in her hearing, and she found out the whole of it in September from a wagon boss who had had too much to say, and when she came at him about it, he told her the truth in 11 words and would not be drawn further. It is a job, Ailsa. You have got a mother buried out there. She stood in her own doorway and understood, with a completeness that took the legs out from under her, that this man had now given up his land and his name for her in the space of 4 months, and had described neither one as a sacrifice. She told him about the courthouse steps that night, because he had told her about the winter of 1877, and it was owed. I want you to know what you paid for, she said. I was not brave on those steps. I had been 3 weeks working out that there was no way through it, and I settled on that one, because it was the only one where I did not have to leave. I stood up in front of 200 men and offered to be a thing a man could acquire, and I had made my peace with it, and I want you to understand that when you handed me that deed you did not save a proud woman. You interrupted a woman who had already given up. I have not forgiven myself for it. Cyrus Locke was a long time answering. Your father signed that note on the 14th of November, he said. In Purvis's store in Miles City. I was standing at the far counter buying a rasp. She went very still. I knew what he was signing, and I knew what 9% on $1,100 does to a man on that divide, and I said nothing. Because it was not my business, and because he was a proud man, and because I did not want to be told to mind myself. He looked at his hands. I have had that 14th of November every day since February. So do not tell me about not forgiving yourself, Ailsa. I did not interrupt you on those steps. I was paying for the rasp. She crossed the 2 feet. What passed between them then was brief, and it was the first for both of them in a long while. And what broke open in her was not longing, but the plain unbearable relief of being known entire by a man who had handed her his worst account of himself and had asked for nothing in exchange. Craddock pushed 3,000 head onto the Kennard Spring on the 10th of September, 1884, and the narrator sets the date down carefully, because 11 men remembered it for the rest of their lives. He did it in daylight, and he did it legally, or nearly, driving the herd up onto the open range that bounded her quarter section on 3 sides, and letting them drift to the only water in 14 miles. 3,000 head would drink that spring down and break the seep to mud, and it would be 6 weeks recovering, and there were 4 trail herds still to come north that season, and Ailsa Kennard would lose the whole of her year, and Craddock would still be there in the spring. The storm came up out of the southwest at 9 that night, with no more warning than the country ever gives. What turned that herd was the thunder, and what killed men in a stampede in 1884 was never the cattle, but the ground, and the ground east of the Kennard Spring fell away at 3/4 of a mile into a cut bank 40 feet deep that no Texas cowboy had ever seen, and no Texas horse could see at night. Cyrus Locke was out on the flat when it went, because he had been sleeping in the wagon shed since August, and because he had gone out at the first thunder the way a man does who has held herds for 22 years. He got 2 of Craddock's night riders turned back and out of the front of it, and he took a horse down in the dark doing it, and came up with a broken forearm and a hoof cut over his eye and could not get back on. Ailsa Kennard came out of that house in her father's coat on a 14-year-old cow horse that knew the divide the way she knew it. She did not go at the herd. She went along it, up the west side, 3/4 of a mile at a dead run in the dark on ground she had ridden 10,000 times, and she got out in front of the point at the coulee head and turned them west into the rising ground, and the leaders went with her, and 3,000 cattle came around behind them like water going round a stone, and they ran themselves out on the long slope and stood blowing in the rain. Not one man died. Not one head went over the cut bank. It was in the Yellowstone Journal on the 20th of September in 11 lines, and the 11 lines named her, and by October it had been told in every wagon camp from the Musselshell to the Belle Fourche, and it was never told the same way twice, and it was always true in the part that mattered, which was that the woman had turned the herd. Hollis Craddock stood in her yard at 6 the next morning with his hat off. He had not slept, and he had counted his cattle, and he had counted his men. "You had every reason on God's earth to let them run," he said. "They were not the cattle's fault, Mr. Craddock, no." He turned the hat over. "My directors arrive on the 19th. I find I am going to have a good deal to explain to them, and I find I would rather explain it myself than have it explained by 11 witnesses." He wrote to Edinburgh that week. The letter survives, and it is a better letter than the man who wrote it, and it contains the sentence, "I have been 4 years in the wrong about that quarter section, and about the person on it." The Tongue River Cattle Company contracted with Ailsa Kennard on the 4th of October, 1884, for water rights on the South Range at $400 the season, a contract renewed every year for 19 years. Hollis Craddock kept his position until 1891 and was never afterward, by any account, an easy man. But he was never again that particular kind of hard. The blacklist came off Cyrus Locke in November, quietly, the way such things come off with nobody admitting there had ever been one. By then he had no use for it. They were married on the 11th of December, 1884, in the front room of the 2-room house, by a Presbyterian minister, who had come out 24 miles in weather, with the wagon boss who had talked too much standing up as a witness, which everybody agreed was fitting. The Quarter Circle Heart was re-registered in the territory of Montana in the spring of 1885, number 411 in both their names, and the first stock it ever went on was 90 head of horses. Because the Kennard place was no good for cattle, and never had been, and both of them knew it. Horses, and water, and one night's grass at $15 the 100 head. They ran that ground for 31 years, and they buried 2 of their 4 children on it and raised the other 2, and the daughter took the horses, and the son took the water contracts, and Ailsa Kennard Locke died in 1927 in the same 2 rooms with the walls built out around them. The iron hung on a nail by the kitchen door for the whole of that marriage, and it was not an ornament, because it was used every spring of 31 years, and it was the only object in that house that either of them would have gone back into a fire for. It is on a wall in Custer County, Montana, today. The family that has it can tell you it was carried in a war bag for 12 years by a man saving toward a place he never bought, and that on the 3rd of May, 1884. He spent the whole of that place on the south steps of the courthouse at Miles City, and handed a woman a deed, and walked off up the street without waiting to be thanked. If your heart has ever leaned toward a story where love arrived quiet and stayed long enough to change everything, then this story was for you. Out on the Powder River Divide, where the wind keeps the only memory of what was. The love between Cyrus Locke and Ailsa Kinnaird became the kind that does not need anybody to remember it to be real, though that country remembered it anyway. Every September, every time somebody at a wagon camp started a story with the words, "There was a woman once who turned 3,000 head in the dark." If stories of frontier love that endured through hardship, prejudice, and the kind of silence only the West knows speak to you, follow the lonesome trail for more. Here the love stories are quiet, the courage is real, and the last word is always worth the wait. Until the next trail.